events that I figured out how to get a microphone off stand. Right. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's truly a pleasure for me to be here. I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about some of the thinking and research that went into Station 11. I know not all of you have read the book, so there'll be no spoilers. And maybe I'll close with a very brief reading, and then we'll have time for some questions after that. So, as Lauren mentioned, and actually before I begin, I would like to thank the library staff for making this happen. It's a wonderful thing. I think adding music and ice cream was inspired. That doesn't happen very often. And I'd like to thank the musicians. It was wonderful to hear that music as this was kicking off. So, I'm here with my fourth novel, Station 11. For anybody who hasn't read it, it's about a traveling Shakespearean theater company and orchestra in a post-apocalyptic North America. And the starting point for this book was partly just that I wanted to write something very different from my previous 3 novels. Those first 3 books, I'm happy with the way they turned out. They were generally categorized as literary noir. I've always been interested in writing, I guess what you could call literary fiction, by which I mean fiction with an emphasis on character development and on the style of the prose. But I've never wanted to sacrifice plot. I've always wanted the strongest possible narrative drive. And it turns out that if you write a literary novel with a crime in it, you've written a crime novel. I was surprised. So what I found is that I had written these 3 books, which were sometimes categorized as literary noir, sometimes categorized as crime, depending on the market. In France, I marketed as a thriller writer. It's the same book, it's a marketing decision. I realized that if I were to continue in that genre indefinitely, that I would eventually be pigeonholed as a crime writer. And I have such respect for what crime writers do, and I very much enjoy crime fiction. But the thought of being pigeonholed as anything was so profoundly unappealing to me. So I thought it might be a good moment to do something completely different. I love film and theater. I was interested in writing about what it means to devote your life to your art, the costs and the joys of that. So I thought for my new book, I would write about the lives of actors. And originally I was thinking it would be set entirely in the present day. I was imagining kind of a quiet, not very plot-driven novel about the life of an actor in a traveling Shakespearean theater company. But at the same time, there was something that I've been wanting to write about for a while, and I've been thinking for some time about how to address it, which is the sense of awe that I feel. And it sounds a little cheesy, but I think awe is the right word, at the technology that we live with. There are a lot of things about this world that are absolutely appalling. But we live in a time where it's possible to cross the Atlantic Ocean in 6 hours. We live in a time where speaking with someone on the far side of the world is as simple as entering a series of numbers into a handheld device. We call that device a telephone. What it is, in fact, is a supercomputer that fits in the palm of our hands. Someone walked into this room this morning, flipped a switch, and the room was flooded with electric light. These are extraordinary things that, of course, we don't really notice because you never really notice the things that you have the luxury of taking for granted. But it seemed to me that it would be interesting to find a way to write about these things, to write about the modern world more broadly. And it occurred to me that an interesting way to consider the modern world would be to write about its absence. So I decided to keep that initial idea of the traveling theater company, but set it in a post-apocalyptic landscape. So the question I've tried to address in Station 11 is, what would we miss? What would we long for and try to recreate if all of the trappings of the modern world were to fall away? Susan Sontag said something interesting about writing in an interview once. She said, "What I love, what draws me very much to writing, is it's a way of paying attention to the world." That quote resonated with me. It's always been my intention to try to pay as much attention as possible, which I think is true of most readers. We're trying to engage with the world through books and otherwise. And As I was writing Station 11, I found myself thinking often of the details of this world that surrounds us, the lights, the electricity, the transcontinental flight. And it was a little unsettling because, of course, you find yourself thinking about how fragile this world is and what life might look like if those things were to fall away. I remember when I first started working on this book, this would have been, I guess, about 4 years ago now. I was describing the premise of the book to my husband. You know, I've got this crazy idea for a book about a traveling Shakespearean theater company in a post-apocalyptic North America. He didn't laugh, which I appreciated. And he said something interesting that stayed with me through the writing of this book. He said, people would want what was best about the world. And this is obviously a completely subjective value judgment on my part. But it seemed to me that one of the things that was best about the world would be the works of William Shakespeare. So, you know, the first few drafts of the book, I had the traveling company performing plays from a whole range of eras. So it was William Shakespeare. It was also David Mamet. I also had them performing modern teleplays, Seinfeld and How I Met Your Mother. And I don't know, I mean, that would have been an interesting book, would have been a very different book. But it just started to seem a little bit incongruous to me that these post-apocalyptic audiences would be really interested in comedies about the New York City real estate market and, you know, post-college dating, which I don't mean to imply those aren't important topics if you're caught up in them, but it seemed a little bit off. So I thought, how about if I keep the repertoire to works from before the age of widespread electricity? That seemed to me to be a very clear demarcation point. But as I began to think more about what that repertoire might look like, and I realized that I didn't really know very much about Shakespeare's life or his work. I'd only read a couple of his plays. So as I began to think about what the repertoire would be, what I realized was that there were some really interesting parallels between Shakespeare's life and time and the post-apocalyptic, post-pandemic era that I was writing about. The most obvious being, of course, that in Elizabethan England, theater would so often have been a matter of these small traveling companies of players setting out on the road, performing to somewhat isolated communities of people. And I loved the symmetry of the idea of a world in which such a company might again set up, the age of electricity having come and gone. But there was something else that I hadn't previously considered, and that was the extent to which Shakespeare's life was marked by the episodes of bubonic plague that swept again and again across Elizabethan England. The year that Shakespeare was born, in the village of Stratford-upon-Avon, for the first half of that year, the village registry shows 20 deaths, which is about what you might expect for a small town in the 1500s. The second half of the year shows more than 200, because that was the year when an outbreak of plague arrived. It was a devastating outbreak. It took out about 20% of the population of London. So you can only imagine what a terrifying year that would have been to give birth to a child, especially for Shakespeare's parents, who had previously lost 2 infant daughters. So Shakespeare is the third born to his parents, the first to survive infancy. And the plague goes on to mark his life in sometimes in very clear ways. His brother Edmund died of plague at 27 in London. Scholars think the plague might have been what killed his only son, Hamnet, who died at 11 and left behind a twin. And what's also interesting is it affected both his career and possibly his work. You see it in the work, sometimes quite overtly. There's a brutal moment in King Lear when Lear compares one of his daughters to a plague sore, which in the 1500s is not an abstract insult. People would know what that actually looked like. A moment in Romeo and Juliet when, I think it's Mercutio, says, "A pox upon your house," or "a pox upon your houses." What a devastating oath in a time when people would have experienced that, what a pox upon your house actually looked like. Sometimes it's less overt. And you know, it's hard to know all these years later what's really there and what you're reading into it. But there's a moment that I find myself thinking of in Hamlet, toward the beginning of the play, when Hamlet encounters the ghost of his father for the first time. So Hamlet's father stands on the parapet, describing his untimely death to his son. And the words he uses, I'm paraphrasing it slightly, but it's to the effect that there was a poison that ran swift as quicksilver through his body. In the context of that time and place, with pandemics sweeping over England again and again, it's so easy to imagine the quicksilver contagion doing the same. And perhaps what's on the page is all there is. And perhaps Shakespeare's only son, Hamnet, died of something quite different. But Hamlet stands on one side of death, his father on the other, a toxicant between them. And as William Shakespeare writes those words, his son, Hamnet, has been dead for no more than 4 years. That was a time, or the years leading up to that were a time when Shakespeare was kind of a rewrite man. You know, in those days, authorship was very different. You often wrote plays in conjunction with several other people. Shakespeare specialized in rewrites and in writing plays in collaboration. But what would happen in that era was that every time a play came through London, which was not an uncommon event, the theater companies would take off. The theaters in London would be closed because it was just way too dangerous to have people gathered together in close proximity. So the companies would take off for an extended tour through the countryside, and Shakespeare, as one of the writers, would be left somewhat at loose ends. And perhaps Shakespeare would have become Shakespeare as we know him, under any circumstance. But there was one particularly long, enforced sabbatical, you could call it, where the company had set out, Shakespeare was left alone, kind of at loose ends in London. And he emerged from that enforced sabbatical, from that period of not working with the company, as a completely different and wholly original poet and playwright. In the years that followed, he wrote the plays that we consider among his masterpieces, Romeo and Juliet, Love, Slave, or Lost. So it began to seem to me that there were some fascinating parallels between Shakespeare's time and the time that I was writing about. So it began to seem more and more natural to me that the company in Station 11 would be an exclusively Shakespearean company. And there was something else, which is that, of course, the situation in Station 11 is one of profound disorientation, because the world has changed so abruptly for these people. The carpet's kind of been pulled out from under them. And it seemed to me that in that circumstance, you might begin to think differently about continuity, about the idea of home, about how to find some kind of steadiness in your life when the world so suddenly changed. And it seemed to me that there was a kind of steadiness in the idea of only performing the work of one playwright. It seemed to me that for people who had lost everything, whose worlds had completely changed, that going back to those plays might seem a kind of homecoming.